that the correct?
This one. No, it's same. We
Same.
kept
So
it the
yeah, so
same.
the tier 1 would stay the same. It's
That's correct.
tier 2 and 3 that would, under the proposal, increase.
Yeah, we designed it that way because tier 1, 0 to 10 is considered basic necessity needs,
Okay.
and we didn't want to change that. We wanted to keep that intact the best we possibly could without impacting some of the,
I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so Bill, on this slide, how did you come up with 34.38 as the base charge when the
okay.
average is 51?
the 34.38, you're talking about the monthly service charge?
Yeah.
That's the new proposed charge for a 1-inch meter fixed cost under our rate study. That would be the new proposed one. So the one on the right is what our proposal will be. We wanted to give you kind of like before and after, assuming that the board feels that this is a fair rate design.
And what is this based on? I guess I'm trying to understand the 34.38.
The 34.38 is the fixed cost
I know,
for a
but
1-inch meter.
why not like 40 or 45? Because it's still a lot lower than the average.
Because we did a study with Raftellus, and they determined that's the actual cost for service for a 1-inch meter. They determined it for each one of our meter levels. They did a volumetric analysis and a cost analysis to come up with what that cost would be for each one of our particular customers.
Yeah, so I think maybe to clarify, so we can't just set it based on what others do. It has to be based on data as far as what our cost of service
Yeah,
is,
it's-
correct?
And what's interesting, Greg's,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that point, yeah.
the next slide, please. We felt it'd be somewhat interesting for you to take a look at the impact and the changes that have occurred in the service area itself since 2017 on forward to 24. We took into account the California Cost of Construction Index, the fact that that's when we're doing our construction work, our projects, our CIP work. The impact that it's had over the last 8 years is a 46% increase. On an average, that's 6% per year. So, as you know, we're heavily based upon construction activity in our budget. And then the CPI itself, and we use the California Consumers CPI for all consumers, all items for San Bernardino County. And you can see over that same 8-year period is 27% increase, average 3% per year. To put things into perspective, when we've had a 0 rate increase, that tells you that we've been operating very lean machine here and done a really outstanding job of controlling costs. But we've gotten to the point now that we have to take a look at that. We can't hold the line much longer, and so this rate study that you've commissioned is very timely and something that we need to take care of and do. Next slide. So if there's not any additional questions for me, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn this over to John Wright, who's the lead consultant with Raftellus. He also has a couple of his other members that have worked with him on this study, and I'll let them kind of introduce themselves. But they've done a very thorough, extensive job with the district, and I thought they've challenged us every step of the way, and I felt that, as you know, they're one of the leading firms in doing water rate analysis and cost of service studies in the United States, and we're very glad that they did such a great job for us. So with that, let me turn it over to Raftellus.
Let me just, any questions for Bill before we hand it over?
Just one last question. Thank you for
Yeah, go ahead.
on the last slide. Just so that I understand, the 6% and 3%, does that mean that we are 9% behind?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
On the slide, the 6% for the California Construction Index average per year and the 3% average for the Consumer Price Index, does that mean that we are behind 9%?
No, it means that each index is identified independently. The cost sources are different. In the California Construction Index, it's very concentrated, relates only to construction work, through the labor charges and then through the construction and the materials. That tends to go up more than other types of services. CPI is related to all goods and services, so it's somewhat watered down. Some things don't go up as quickly, but we wanted to give you a perspective from 2 points. We're heavy construction related. Our costs go up more than the CPI, so we wanted to give you somewhat of a perspective of we're being pressed because of the costs, and then two, the CPI, because keep in mind, we just gave our employees a 4% increase, and we have a MOU in place that they'll be getting 4% for 4 years. So we know that we have to do some increasing.
Yeah, probably maybe a better way to look at it is that really the true cost is somewhere between the 27 and the 46 over the past 8 years, is how much everything else has gone up while we've kept everything for us at the same rate. Is that maybe a better way to explain
I
it?
think that's a very fine way of explaining it.
Okay.
One thing, had we done some rate increases along the way, we probably would have been able to put more money into reserves than we have now. But that being said, we're where we're at right now. We got to move forward.
Yeah, it's amazing record. Amazing.
It is, but you can definitely see, particularly with what happened after COVID, just how much everything shot up cost-wise. And I know we all see it on a daily basis at the grocery store and at the gas pump. But, certainly this, I think, helps illustrate that depending on whether you're looking on the lower end with CPI or the higher end with the construction industry, just how much the cost of everything has gone up while we've kept the cost of water flat. Yeah. So, all right. Any other questions for Bill?
Okay, with that,
All right.
I want
Go
to
ahead.
thank you for listening, and I'd like to turn it over now to Raftellus, and then they can go through the cost of service study, their recommendations, and long-range financial plan, and they can answer all the tough questions you have. So, John, it's yours.
Okay, Bill, thank you so much for that introduction. Let me try to make sure that I get set up here so that you can see my screen. Hopefully you're seeing my screen.
Yes.
Yes.
Hopefully you're hearing me.
Yes. A little soft, but we can hear you.
Yeah, let me get a little bit closer. So first off, thanks again for having us here tonight, and also thank you for retaining our services on your study. Are you seeing some additional stuff besides my slide?
Yeah, we can see the presenter view. There.
How about that?
That's
That's
perfect.
better.
Thank you.
Albert, would
Yeah,
you mind
thank
turning
you.
up the volume also so we can hear him a little louder?
I will try to speak as loud as I can, and I apologize
No,
if.
we got you better. We upped it on our end, so thank you.
Oh, okay, terrific. So tonight we're going to talk about the objectives of the rate study project that the district hired us to complete and what that process is. We're going to talk about our proposed financial plan and then also talk about our proposed FY26 rates. When you think about the services the district retained us to perform, well, one was the development of a 10-year financial plan. The second was a cost of service study with the development of proposed rates for the period FY26 through FY29. And those are the rates that would be listed in the district's Proposition 218 notice. The district also hired us to complete a comprehensive rate survey, but I don't know how we could do anything more comprehensive than what Bill has just presented to you. So he may have checked that box for us here tonight. Then we've developed a Microsoft Excel financial model, which will, of course, be the property of the district, and that hopefully Bill and Gustavo and other members of the finance team might get some use of in the future. And then two board presentations that are related to the Proposition 218 process. And I think one of those board presentations would be coming before the board and seeking authorization to issue the Prop 218 notice. And then the second presentation would be a formal Prop 218 hearing. So just a slide or two regarding the rate study process. It really starts out in the lower left with what we've labeled study framework. And this is sitting down with the utility client, in this case, obviously West Valley, understanding what your issues and challenges are financially, understanding your system demographics and infrastructure, and talking about your objectives for not only your overall financial plan, but also objectives regarding your rate structure. And an example of that might be your objectives in terms of what percentage of revenue you'd like to see come from fixed sources versus variable commodity rates. And once we have that study framework in place, we would develop a financial plan. And an outcome of that financial plan will be a projection of the amount of rate revenue we need to earn on an annual basis to cover our costs. And then finally is the cost of service and rate design process, which I'll talk about here in a few slides. And then finally, the whole rate approval and implementation process, which is really related to meeting all the Proposition 218 requirements. Now, two things to note. There's an arrow above this slide that says Proposition 218 compliance. And so I think what we want to try to convey here is throughout the study, we constantly have to keep Proposition 218 in mind. And it's not something that we can sort of graft on to the end of the process, but it's something that has to kind of permeate our thinking throughout the study. And then depending on the client in question, some clients don't have a formal public outreach process. Others have a public outreach process that pretty much starts at the start of the study and goes through the very end of the study. I see that Lutfi is in attendance at our meeting tonight. And so I want to caveat what I'm about to say, that this is a high-level summary of Proposition 218 requirements from the perspective of a rate consultant, not an expert regulatory attorney like Lutfi is. But when you think about Proposition 218, I tend to think of it as a cost of service mandate. And by that, I mean that the state is requiring the rates we develop to be proportional to the cost that we incur to provide service. So let's start with the first bullet point. You really can't collect rate revenues that exceed your costs. Now, under Proposition 218, you can build up cash reserves, as an example. But basically, we're not going to be able to collect $100 million of rate revenues when our only legitimate costs are $50 million. The rate revenues that we collect have to be used for utility service. There's that key third bullet point that the rates, in this case, it's described as the fees, have to be proportional to the cost to provide service. Probably the next bullet, it goes without saying, the service has to be available. And then Proposition 218 has a lot of noticing requirements. There has to be a 45-day notice period before the utility governing body can actually vote to implement new rates. And that assumes that there are not enough protests to derail it. So I think that under Prop 218, basically, you will be seeking your customer base to submit a protest if they have an objection. And if 50% plus one protest, I believe that you're not able to implement rates, but if less than that does, you can go ahead and implement rates after giving the appropriate notice period. Just a really high-level look at financial planning, and we worked a lot with Bill and Gustavo on this financial planning process. And when we look at the gray box on the left, and we think about how we go about doing financial planning, Well, one thing we do is we project revenues, and we project those revenues at existing rates without any rate increases. And so the process of projecting revenues really involves, number one, doing a demand forecast and looking at issues like what we believe customer account growth is going to be on the system over the next 5 to 10 years. And then calculating that revenue at existing rates based on the forecast build consumption that would be associated with that customer account growth. But the key term there is revenue at existing rates. Then we would also, as part of the financial planning process, project our costs, and we'd ask ourselves, what are projected O&M expenses? And we would consider as part of O&M expenses inflationary adjustments with assumptions regarding what we think inflation is going to be for various types of costs over the planning horizon. We will also be projecting rate-funded capital improvement program expenditures. And there's also a construction cost inflation assumption associated with that. Our contractually required debt service payments for existing debt, and then also projected debt service to the extent we need to issue new debt. Also, we'd be projecting cash reserves to maintain the reserves that we believe are necessary to mitigate risks. But that difference between projected revenues at existing rates and projected costs is invariably a funding gap, where we don't have enough rate revenues to cover our costs. And so we identify that funding gap, and then we solve for the level of rate revenues we need to make sure that we can cover our cost. And the outcome over on the right is just a projection of required annual rate revenue increases. So when you think about the district, think, well, what are some of the key financial drivers associated with West Valley Water District? Well, one, like many districts, is the cost to repair and rehabilitate your existing infrastructure. Number two is the debt service that you're going to have to pay on your state revolving fund loans. And you've taken on some, I think, 2 large loans recently. Bill, correct me if I'm misspeaking, but you have been taking on new debt and you do have debt service. Another interesting thing that's going on with the district is that, well, you have, I think, pretty healthy revenues from capacity charges, very healthy cash collections from capacity charges. You also have some very big capacity, or we might say growth-related infrastructure that you have to make, growth-related CIP. And so that differential between what you're collecting from capacity fees and the growth-related CIP you have to build is another financial driver. And then for all utilities, projected inflation. So when we did the financial plan working with Bill's team, here are some key, I guess, facts associated with it. Number one, we started with your adopted 2025 budget as the baseline for projecting forward. And when we projected capital improvement expenditure costs, we assumed a 90% capital project completion factor. So for every $100 of CIP expenditures that you have planned, we assumed that you would complete 90% or $90 out of that 100. So there's not much of a fudge factor there. That's a fairly high completion rate that was an assumption in the model. 2% annual customer account growth, and then maintaining a cash reserves for operational expenditures equal to 180 days of annual O&M expenses, or 6 months of annual O&M expenses. And then maintaining cash reserves associated with your capital improvement project expenditures equal to 80% of next year's projected CIP cost. And so we think of operating cash reserves. If you are in a situation where you have drought curtailments, you need to have operating cash reserves. If you're in a situation, and I don't know to what extent this would really happen in California, where we had a very cool, wet summer and you didn't sell as much water as you think, or as you planned on, you need operating reserves. If you have an issue with your billing system, you need operating reserves. And what the capital improvement reserve does for us is it puts us in a situation where, to the extent we have a problem with operating cash flow and we can't really transfer money in to pay for capital improvements, we have money we can fall back on. And of course, that capital improvement cash reserve is also very, very helpful for us in terms of constructing things before we get reimbursement from the state, from state revolving loan funds, and also dealing with major problems that we hope will never arise. But having some dollars in that capital improvement cash reserve is very helpful in that regard. I've summarized some of the annual inflation cost estimates that are built into our projections. I think they're pretty straightforward. I think one interesting one, from my own personal perspective, is energy at a 5% annual rate. I would imagine if we looked at Southern California Edison over recent years, it may be a little bit more than 5%. But from our perspective, these inflation assumptions are not outlandish or excessive. So in looking at your capital improvement plan, what I have over on the right is projected capital improvement program expenditures in a table format. And I've only focused on 5 years from FY26 to FY2030 because really your CIP plan is only fleshed out in detail for the first 5 years of the 10-year planning horizon. But it comes to $109 million. And a lot of that is growth-related CIP that's going to be funded by connection fees or existing restricted cash reserves you have for connection fees. A lot of it, $44.2 million, is going to be funded through operational cash flow from rate revenues. Then there is an assumption about some grant funding. And then the graph on the left side tries to visually represent what that CIP is and what the projected funding sources are. And then as you can see, once we start to get out in the second half of the planning horizon, the projected CIP with the little bars that don't go up very high kind of falls off. It's not that you're not going to have expenditures out there. It's just right now they're not quite fleshed out. So here's a proposed financial plan, and I do have graphs on the next slide of the showing proposed annual rate revenue increases. Now it doesn't mean that everybody across your 3 tiers are going to have a 6% increase. The 6% increase that you see in column 2 is the total system rate revenue increase. The total system. What an individual customer is going to see on his or her bill may be a different percentage based on what consumption tier they're in, what size meter they have. So a series of annual 6% increases and a projection in the third column over of what your ending cash reserve balances will be. And these ending cash reserves are basically cash reserves associated with operations, capital improvements, and also restricted cash, which in the district's case is primarily used restricted cash associated with connection fees. And then finally, a projection of your debt service coverage over the next 5 years. So here are a couple of graphs. the graph on the left is basically showing you in these bars different expenses and operational cash outcomes. So if we look at sort of the darker blue, that's total O&M costs that we're projecting each year. Hopefully you can see it, but there's a dark green, which is projected debt service costs, and then a lighter blue, which is a projected PAYGO, i.e. rate-funded capital improvements, PAYGO, CIP. You see that through 2029, in the gray, we dip below the zero axis, and we actually have negative net operating cash flow. And one might ask, well, how is it possible to survive and have net operating cash flow? Well, because you have cash reserves, and you can we can lower those cash reserves. And then also on the left is you see a projection with a yellow line of your rate revenues at current rates. And then the blue line is a projection of your rate revenues at proposed rates. Over on the right side of this slide, we see combined cash reserves graphed. And one of the things that's important to note about this is that you can see starting out in maybe 2030, 2031, you see this buildup of cash reserves. Well, once again, that's because there may be more CIP expenditures out there than we currently have projected, because it is the second half of the 10-year planning horizon. So this notion of a cost of service study really tries to answer how much should customers pay? And once again, you've heard me say this on the Prop 218 slide, customers should pay rates that are proportional to the costs incurred to provide service to them. And this is not only the Proposition 218 mandate, but it's also an industry standard concept as to how rates should be developed, and the fact that they should be closely aligned to the cost incurred to provide service. And this is talked a lot in American Water Works Association Manual M1. And Manual M1 is Principles of Water Rates, Fees, and Charges. And it is an industry standard publication that is closely aligned with the requirements of Prop 218 from a cost of service perspective. But we want to never forget in California, Prop 218 is what controls in California, not anything that comes out of the American Water Works Association. But this notion of cost being proportional to the rate you charge is a very standard perspective. And so when we do a cost of service study, we have to basically ask ourselves the question, well, we're incurring these different types of costs, and how do we allocate these costs in a manner that results in customers paying rates that are proportional to the cost to serve them? And some of the types of costs that we need to allocate are water supply costs, costs of meeting base, or another way of saying that is average day demand, and costs of meeting peak demands. And every utility system has periods in the summertime on a maximum day basis or a maximum hour basis where peak demand occurs. And the level of demand is quite a bit higher than it would be on a base or average day basis. And we need to design, construct, and operate our systems to meet that peak demand, because it's a lot more expensive than it would be if we just had the same demand every day of the year and every hour of the year. Also, meter related and customer service costs, another big category. And so is fire protection. So I hope my graphic works here, but this revenue requirement bucket is the amount of rate revenue we determine we need based on the financial planning process. And the cost of service study is just going through the process of allocating these costs um, to these various categories. So something that we spent a lot of time talking about with Bill and his team is your existing rate structure. And as Bill has already indicated in his presentation, you have a three-tiered rate structure where tier 2 goes up to 50 HCF. And then tier 3 starts at 51 and above. And what Raftellus would like to propose to you is maintaining this three-tier rate structure approach that would be applied to all of your customer types, but changing tier 2 from a threshold of 50 HCF to 30 HCF. And we believe that it would be wise to do that for the items that are listed under the rationale there. So the first thing, and Bill noted this, is that customers don't pay the tier 3 highest marginal rate until they hit 50. That's a lot of water, especially for any residential customer. As Bill noted, single family residential is 93% of your accounts. I think Bill said 92, and about 62% of your demand. And bullet point number 3, we note that single family residentials have minimal tier 3 usage. Based on Bill's presentation, they may have no tier 3 usage.
John, I have a question if I may
Yes.
interrupt. Do you know
course.
the approximate percentage of residents or connections it might affect for the reduction going from a threshold or a top threshold of 50 down to 30? Are you talking about 10,000 residents or about 50,000?
No, I think that obviously you're in all of your customers, including your single family residential customers, would be affected. But right now, you basically have virtually no single family residential customers that ever get into tier 3 under the existing arrangement. And forgive me if I haven't answered
Recall
the
that
question.
96% of our customers are residential, which are in the tier 1.
I will say this, it looks like from the analysis, when you look at the usage per month, you're going to see in the wet months, you're going to see very few people ever hitting it. But in the summer months, if they continue to do watering of their lawns and stuff, that's when you're going to see them hitting tier 3. That would be the only time that you're going to see the residents hitting into tier 3.
Well, and your fourth bullet point says that the average consumption in the summer is 27. So there probably is a few that might go above the 30, but probably most people would be like right near it, maybe, but not going past it then.
Okay.
And you're going to find that as we continue with conservation demands, that will induce people to use less, and so less will be affected by a tier 3. But in looking at the way that Raftellus put this thing together, it will get us a little additional revenue, but also an incentive for people to conserve. So I think it meets the requirements of the state, and I like the way they designed it.
Yeah, thank you for jumping in and giving a better answer than I was probably giving. One thing that's kind of nice about having the tiers at 1 to 10 and 11 to 30 is that 1 to 10 in tier 1, it really allows customers to have an adequate amount of water, even if they have a lot of residents in a household, for non-discretionary indoor water usage. And then going from 11 to 30 provides an amount of water that is adequate for your average single-family residential customer, even in the outdoor irrigation season. And then when the third tier starts at 31, that is a tier that will capture those single-family residential customers that are doing a lot of outdoor watering, or at least outdoor watering above the average. And so the The tier widths are kind of aligned with non-discretionary indoor, average at tier 2, and then above average at tier 3. And then as Bill noted in sort of looking at this final bullet point, the moving the tier 2 to 30 ACF will allow the district to send a water use efficiency price signal to customers with a above average usage. But there's something that's very key in this last bullet point, and I'm just going to read it for emphasis. The proposed tier 2 consumption threshold of 30 HCF sends a cost-based water use efficiency price signal. The key words there are cost-based. We're in California, and every rate we charge in every tier has to be cost-based. It can't be a policy decision. So now let's look at the cost basis associated with these, and that'll be the next 2 slides. I realize this slide's got a lot of things going on, but sort of the top half of the slide is the level of costs associated with water supply across the 3 proposed tiers, electric power across the 3 proposed tiers, and then meeting base or average demand once again, and then meeting a max day demand and an estimated max hour demand. So these are on top sort of the volumetric costs associated with these 3 tiers. Now the bottom half of this slide really looks at fixed costs. And your system, the costs that have been designated as fixed are recovered through your monthly meter charge, your monthly service charge. And a small amount of them are recovered through private fire lines. And so here we've identified meter-related costs, customer service, and private fire line costs. All of them add up to the blue box that says total revenue requirement, $28.8 million. And that $28.8 million can be traced directly back to our financial plan. So that's the revenue requirement linkage to the financial plan.
And John, I think our general manager kind of touched on a little bit of the water supply aspect of this. You know, I think, John, you kind of used a peak season kind of a example earlier that, you know, when we have the higher demand, especially in those months, we often have to turn on pumps that we normally maybe have off the rest of the year because they are more expensive to operate. Maybe they have additional treatments that need to be done to those sources of water. So yeah, it really does kind of show the difference between our less expensive water that we tap into as much as possible versus the ones that we have to go to during the peak periods.
Yeah. Big
Yeah, and
difference.
let's look, yes, sir, and that's a great point. And then let's look at it just based on the point you just made. Well, Guy, I was excited to go to a different slide, but here's your existing rate structure, just showing your existing commodity rates and your existing service charges. And Bill covered that in detail. So let's now look at proposed FY26 rates on a unitized basis. What we've done is we've taken those costs by tier or costs by meter size, and we've unitized them. And so Councilman, look at the water supply unit cost. So tier 1 is that low cost well water, very low cost supply. Tier 2 are our higher cost supplies, and then tier 3 is our highest cost supplies. Then when we move over to power, we've got a uniform cost of service of 64 cents, which is, you know, a part of our overall commodity charge. Our base costs and our max stay costs and our max hour costs have been spread uniformly across the 3 tiers. And so the outcome on the commodity side is that, you know, and this was kind of a wonderful serendipity, but the outcome on the commodity side is there's no change in the tier 1 rate. And there are minor increases in the tier 2 and tier 3 rate based on these cost inputs. And you can see those over in the two far right columns. Now, when we think about our monthly service charges, what we can see is two things. One that Bill talked about is that the proposed monthly service charges, as we increase in meter size, are quite a bit more than your existing monthly service charges. And I'll just focus on the bottom one, which is a proposed 8-inch charge of $804 per month compared to your current $261. And that $803 is composed of two components, and these are to the left. One is what might be called a capacity component, and this is basically the cost of covering the fact that these larger meters can impose an instantaneous flow on your system, and you have these fixed costs that are sitting there to handle that instantaneous flow. There are also some meter maintenance and replacement costs in there. And then the other part of the meter charge is a monthly billing component. So Bill talked about that, which was how we're increasing our monthly service charge, we're proposing to, at these higher meter sizes. But another thing, and I don't know whether Bill really touched on it, is for the 5/8 and 3/4 inch customers, the actual monthly meter charge goes down by $1.82. Now, on your system currently, as I understand it, when there's a new customer connection, it's a 1-inch connection. And so there is a little bit of increase with a 1-inch, for a 1-inch connection, 52 cents compared to what the current charge is. But for that installed base of customers with 5/8 or 3/4 inch meters, there's actually a decline in the proposed meter charge. So an interesting outcome of these proposed rates, and let's characterize these proposed rates in the following way. Very minor increases on the commodity side and relatively significant increases for the larger meter sizes on the fixed charge side. One of the interesting things is the effect it would have on the profile of your rate revenue recovery. And so right now, when we look at FY25, the current fiscal year, and a projection of what your rate revenues are, basically 34% of your rate revenue recovery for FY25 is projected to be from a fixed sources, monthly service charge and some minor private fire line. And 66% is projected to be commodity rates, a variable recovery. Under the proposed rates, if they were to be implemented by you for FY26, we would actually see a pretty significant increase in fixed revenue recovery from 34 up to 40%. And we think that's justified on a cost basis. And it's also a trend, that we've seen in recent years as the state goes through drought after drought and state mandated curtailments. Water utilities all over California, or at least Southern California, are really seeking to enhance their fixed revenue recovery. So depending on your point of view, that's a bonus of these proposed rates. Yet, lower consumption customers that never get out of tier 1 don't see a commodity rate increase. And smaller embedded base of 5/8 and 3/4 inch meter size see a little bit of decline. So it seems like a good outcome from a couple different perspectives. And then my bill comparisons, I think, pale to what Bill showed in his presentation. Hopefully that you can follow them. On the top is a customer that has got summer usage of 27 ACF, and they've got a 3/4 inch meter. And under the proposed rates, they would actually have a 97-cent decline. Now, if you were a customer with a newer customer, you had a 1-inch meter, you're using 27 HCF, you'd have a $1.37 increase. And that's a number that's pretty close to what Bill talked about for us. You know, calculating and showing commercial bill impacts, just picking one commercial customer is not enough. But here's a commercial customer with a 2-inch meter. They're using 286 HCF, which happens to be the average for a 2-inch connection. That's a $26.08 increase a month, which works out to basically 3%. Well, that's it for my presentation, but I'm sure there's lots of questions.
And if I may, Mr. Chair, just before we get into the further Q&A, I would like to provide my partner, Luffy Carruth, an opportunity to have some input.
Yes, please.
I would agree that throughout the 218 process goes throughout, so Luffy will need to be involved throughout as well. He's not had a chance to look at this rate study, but I think Luffy has a couple comments for your consideration.
Sure.
So thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff. And yeah, that pretty much actually sums it up. I mean, I just wanted to, I appreciate the presentation or both presentations, but BBK hasn't had a chance to review any of the material. So we may have additional input to provide once the rate study is provided to us. There have been a lot of developments in the law that impact how rates can be established. So we just want to make sure that the board is aware that we'll be providing further legal input as well.
And back before we even got this process started, as you may recall, Luffy did give a presentation on some of the tiered rate issues with the recent court cases. So that's what I think we'll be focusing on as well.
Sure. We would look forward to, I think, a full analysis once he's had time to
Perfect.
go through it with Reptilis.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right, John, I did have a couple questions. So on page 13 of your slide, you talked about the proposed financial plan.
Yes, sir.
So essentially, so let me just kind of maybe summarize this and you tell me if I'm kind of hitting points. So the overall number is 6% over each year for a total of 5 years. But that's the total overall number, with the vast majority of that actually falling maybe on the larger consumers. Whereas our average single family, it looked like it was more like 1.5% to 2%, maybe if that, depending on
Yes,
the
sir.
actual usage. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I think that's absolutely right.
Okay. And so that's as far as we're looking out in this plan, correct? Is those 5 years, as far as increases?
Well, we did, do a 10-year financial plan, and I think that my memory is that we had dialed in maybe 3 and 4% in the second half of the 10-year planning horizon, but
That's correct.
it's a little bit murky because
Yeah, because
a
we don't know
flat-out
the
CIP.
CIP piece. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and that makes complete sense to me. Again, I just want to know what it is we're talking about. Are we talking about just these 5 years, or was there more?
Yeah, we looked at the additional 5 years, and as John indicated, they were 3%, 4% increases, but that isn't really adequate because we haven't got a fleshed out
Sure.
CIP plan for those
So
out years.
after we have Lufty look at it and kind of crunch out, it might only be just these 5, just because that's what we have fully fleshed out.
That's what we were planning on doing,
Okay.
was a 5-year rate increase, not going out beyond year 5.
Again,
And
I just wanted to clarify that because I know we've had different conversations about how far, but I just wanted to clarify based on the presentation.
because our CIP is firm for the 5 years,
Yeah.
that's why we did
Okay.
the proposed rate increase over a 5-year period.
Okay.
Okay.
Anyone else have questions?
Yeah, so to continue with this slide, just to clarify, the 6% is not an annual percentage increase, is it just 6% total?
Yeah, it's the total increase of all revenue at the district, but my understanding is most of that's actually going to fall on the larger consumers because of the increase in the service charge of the larger meters. So that's why when you looked at the one slide further on, the average single family, actually the increase is much smaller because it's only in tier 2 and 3, and it's a much smaller amount because, again, a lot of the increases actually looks like coming from that service charge, correct?
Yes, sir.
And if
Yeah.
if you recall the slide that I showed on these meters, the larger meter sizes,
Yeah.
most utilities follow the same, or probably all are required to follow the same for the 218 process to make sure that the costs are allocated correctly.
Yeah.
You'll see even with that, that they have the same type of trending we do, but ours is at a much lower level because our costs are more controlled.
Yeah.
But they all have that same phenomenon where the small meters have a small charge and the
Sure.
big meters have a big charge.
No, it definitely makes a lot of sense. And, given our cost structure, I wasn't shocked to see we're a little bit on the lower end compared to some of our neighbors. But yeah, certainly it seems like, that upping those amounts will push a lot of that 6% increase really onto those consumers because they're the ones who are consuming the more expensive water that we have to put into production. Yeah.
Okay, so I see this slide 13. Now, if I have questions on slide 14. I'm a little bit confused on.
Can I? Hi, this is Sudhir Pardiwala. I work with John. On the 6%, I would like to just make a couple of comments. What you're seeing there is an overall increase in revenue compared to the current revenue. And so when we look at the demand, increase in demand, we said there is a 2% growth rate in here. So the actual increase is actually, when you consider that 2% of this increase is actually coming from new connections, the effective increases are more in the range of 4% as opposed to 6%.
Oh, okay.
But there is no proposed 4-year, 5-year plan to increase the rates every year over based on pass-throughs or COLAs or, I mean, this is just one set of increases, correct?
That's right.
Okay,
Well, but I thought it was
wait.
5 years of increases.
That's what they're saying is they're using to get you that.
Yeah. So what would happen is, let's say the board elected to implement the rates that you saw in this presentation. The rates we've shown you in this presentation are for FY26. So your FY27 rates would be the 26 rates increased by 6%. Your FY28 rates would be your 27 rates increased by 6%.
So it is
So we're
clear.
starting FY26 with a brand new cost allocations and a new cost of service study outcome. And then every year you would see rate increases that would be tied to these financial planning values.
Okay,
Just-
so just to add to what you just said, so if we don't do, based on your presentation, if we don't do the 6%, then we see a dip in our revenue, which is now your slide 14.
Yes, ma'am.
And if we
yeah.
don't do that 6% increase, then we are already going into the net operation cash flow, which is what the gray portion is of your graph.
Right. And the other, absolutely, I totally agree with you. And when you look at the graph on the right, you see this blue line, which is basically your target reserves. This is the 180 days of annual O&M and 80% of next year's CIP. If you didn't have these increases on a total system basis, one of the things you would see, and it would become especially evident beginning in FY29, is you would actually have combined cash reserves that are less than these targets, than your target is. And so you not only dip into your cash because you'd have a net operating loss that would grow, but you would actually fall below your target starting in FY29. And it's probably a safe assumption that in the second half of the 10-year planning horizon, you're going to have more CIP than what's currently out there.
For sure.
And you're going to be in a position where you're going to be facing that CIP with what may be significantly inadequate cash reserves.
So if I just want to understand or clarify, that the recommendation is a 6% rate increase per year. Otherwise, we're going to be in the deficit. I mean, that's,
I guess I would say we prepared this example at 6% and kind of showing you what happens to our reserves, what happens to rates, what kind of capital completion we're planning. So I think it's a place to start and maybe a place to stay, but it's a place to start the discussion if we like the 4% or the 6%
Yeah.
or not.
Yeah, and then, oh, and he just walked away, but Mr. Wright, I don't know if you're still there. He walked away just as I was about to.
The janitorial staff just started vacuuming, so I had to close
Sorry.
my office door.
Can you go back to page 13, I think it was?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I think that maybe part of the confusion might be on rate. So when you say 6%, what you're saying is we're going to increase total revenues at the global district level by 6%.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, but that may not actually be 6% of actual rate increases. It's just we are raising 6% more revenue. Is that a better way to kind of maybe phrase it?
To me, it is.
Because 2% is
Because
growth.
2% your planning is already growth. So really it's only, we're talking about increasing revenue another 4% through adjusting the rates. Is that correct way to kind of, yeah, because I think people are seeing the 6, but it's really not 6 is what I'm hearing.
That's right.
Yeah, so in theory, wouldn't the board want to adopt in 1/2/18 hearing and 1/2/18 notice a schedule of increases over 5 years and explain upfront this is what's going to go up every year for 5 years on the rates and be done, as opposed to coming back and doing this every year? So
Sure. Yeah, no,
and I guess I just didn't see what that rate schedule was proposed. Maybe it's too early for that, but
At this point, we haven't done the actual rate schedule. This is to get board input.
Gotcha. Okay.
Tonight is the 6% is what's been recommended,
Well,
and we would develop the rate schedules based on that.
so I guess maybe a question I have for you, Bill, is factoring in the fact that we're already thinking 2% a year is just our own natural growth. Is a 4% growth in our revenue enough to keep us in line with our position as, financially?
A lot of what we do here is based upon best guess assumptions that John put together up front.
Yeah.
If we make any kind of assumption changes, that in turn will affect the
Sure.
rates. So, for example, if we do more CIP than we've put into our 5-year plan,
Sure.
we're going to have to figure out, are we going to do it on a pay-go basis, or
Sure.
are we going to increase more debt? So there's different factors on how we figure that out. So we put together what we felt were realistic assumptions, and if we want to look at particular assumptions one by one and see that, no, I don't agree with that one, then that could either have a positive or negative impact on it.
Yeah, I just asking just because I know in some of our earlier conversations we've had over the last year and a half, I think we were thinking it might be higher than realistically. We're talking 4% of an increase because again, you're already figuring in 2% growth.
Well, along with the 2% growth, we also have to realize that there's a reduction in consumption by the customers, as we've showed you. So we feel that there's somewhat of
Yeah,
an
that's-
offset that's taking place.
Okay.
That's why the 6% is a
Yeah.
good number in my mind.
Oh no, I mean honestly, if this is what we can actually do to be financially stable, again, the actual number for most ratepayers is going to be much lower than that because, again, a lot of the burden for the increased revenue would be placed on those larger consumers with the larger meters.
Well, what you see, though, is those larger consumers have been paying artificially low rates on those
Oh no,
meter
I would agree
charges.
with that too.
And-
But I'm just saying, to me, I'm actually quite pleased to see this because this is a lot lower than what I honestly expected.
And the reason we did the analysis on the meters of looking at the other utilities, because we saw these increases were large,
Yeah.
and we wanted to see is that what's actually happening in the industry, and the truth is, yes, it is. And we're still among the lowest,
Yeah.
even going through and correcting something that should have been done a long time ago is, having the people pay the proportional amount related to the service that they're getting.
Sure.
Question, do we know what the CIP plan is for the next 5 years?
We have the CIP approved budget, and so that's included in this analysis. So when the financial plan was established, you as a board approve a 5-year CIP. That was what was used in this analysis. So if there's any changes in the CIP during a 5-year period, that's not incorporated. So an example might be, what if we decide that we want to build a new headquarters here? Then we may want to adjust that at our next budget update.
Sure.
And that in turn, before we finalize our CIP, that may move the needle on the 6% slightly.
Sure.
Depending on we do a pay-go or we use a debt service over
Yeah.
a 20 or 30-year period. Those are things that we haven't worked out details, and board input would be needed, obviously.
Okay. Now, I see that we have the operational cost grants. Are those already grants that are in the queue, or is that grants that we're trying to get?
We have both. What we've done over a 5-year period, again, those grants are considering a 5-year period. We already have grants on the books, things that have been committed, but over a 5-year period, we're anticipating that we're going to be getting additional grants. If they don't happen, then we have a shortfall that it would occur. But in all likelihood, because of the tremendous work that's been going on in the district, where before this hasn't happened, there's been a lot of grant activity. We have a fully staffed group that is focusing on grants, and as such, we're making some great headway. So figuring $1 million a year isn't unreasonable. That's why we picked it at that number.
Yeah.
When we get to the next step in the process, I want to be able to make sure that we incorporate all the COLAs, all these things that we are incorporating that are increasing our debt. And I know that we talked about looking at other studies of if there's any other type of infrastructure that we need to improve, that we need to look at in the next 5 years. And I'm not sure if they're incorporated in the current CIP that we approved.
First off, I think your idea is a good one. We did take a look at the COLAs for the labor and the benefits. We've already cranked that into the calculation. What we have not done is any changes to the 5-year CIP. So as you go into the next budget update, that's something that we should talk about, and I agree, because I know in the recent past, the board's already approved us taking a look at our headquarter facilities, and so we're going to end up having a decision that needs to be made whether we're going to do an upgrade to the existing facility at a certain cost, or we're going to go all in and buy a new facility that will service us for the next 30 to 50 years. So those are decisions the board's going to have to decide on, and in turn, that's going to have an impact on this study. So
absolutely.
before we finalize it, we probably should put a placeholder in there. Doesn't mean we have the final number, but let's say we get from our consultant the cost of a new facility. Let's say it's $20 million. So then we would have to crank that into our CIP over the appropriate period of time that it's going to be constructed.
Sure.
And then are we going to pay for it on a pay-go basis, or are we going to do a debt service? Those are things that we have to do. You're right, Board Member Garcia.
So the current plan, looking ahead 5 years, there's about $150 million in CIP costs, and we're currently undergoing a new water system master plan update. That's certainly going to bring forward new projects. We talked about the headquarters, so I think we should consider baking in a little more flexibility into our CIP projected expenditures. Just looking at the financial assumptions, this is based on a 90% CIP completion factor. I kind of would like to, if we want to get this, if we want to get those projects done in 5 years, let's plan on doing that. I think taking a more conservative approach would be to say we're going to do 100% of the 5-year CIP as planned, knowing that projects are going to come in and go out and change schedules, but that would be more conservative. That would also help. I'm a little concerned about how our reserves are dipping pretty significantly over this 5-year plan. So that would help kind of buoy those capital reserves a little better. And just looking at the other assumptions, we're assuming a 4% cost of construction over that period. If you look at the last 8 years, it's been 6%. So if the board would like, we could look at making some of these, making an alternate proposal and see what that would look like.
Well, I see this as, I mean, my understanding, I mean, this is just a starting point. So, I mean, obviously you and Bill and Raftalis and Lufty and BBK, you all have a lot more to flesh out and to discuss. I mean, I think it's a very good start. But yeah, you're right. We definitely should look at some of those assumptions. The upgraded facilities master plan will definitely give us, I think, a better outlook for the next 5 years. So that will probably also factor in for sure. So yeah, I say let's do all that.
I agree. I agree that I think that we need to look more at our CIP projects, and if wherever we need to do more studies, because we talked about them in our last finance committee, that we needed to do an infrastructure study of really where do we need to do upgrades, if any, and we can start off with a study, and then see if we can add that to the CIP where we can complete them in within the 5 years.
Yeah, and I know that like a lot of our reserves have kind of ballooned up in part because of the capacity charges for some fairly large developments that have been planned. So I think there was always going to be a natural dip anyways, because it kind of shot up over a couple year period. And as we start to build those facilities, that will taper down. But yeah, we definitely want to make sure we maintain healthy reserves after that point. But yeah, there's only so much vacant land left around here that doesn't have a big project already planned for it. So I don't know if we'll ever see it shoot back up that high again. But yeah, I do agree that we need to keep that in mind though too.
Yeah, when we saw those kind of the reserve trends, I mean, those are our limits. That's our, the board has agreed on that. That's our floor, not to go below.
No, I agree. And
we're getting closer.
well, and this is honestly something that honestly this board has previously debated in the past of what is a good reserve level to actually be at. I mean, never mind the unrestricted piece, but what is a healthy reserves? And we've debated that because there's a lot of thought on what that should look like. But yeah, I wasn't surprised to see it's kind of starting to trend down over the next 5 years, because we're going to be building a lot of these facilities that the developers have kind of prepaid for. So not really shocked about that.
So I think it's a good idea for us to go back and make those assumption changes.
Yeah.
I know that 6% number is going to go up a little. I don't know how much, but realistically, we want to do what we need to operate the district properly.
Well, no, for sure. And I mean, I'm, again, quite pleased because, again, it's lower than the number I was expecting, but also the fact that for the average ratepayer, it's actually substantially less than that, because it's really making the ones who like I said, have maybe been paying unusually low amounts of water fees compared to other agencies for those larger meters and the larger amount of tier 3. We're now asking them to actually pay more of their fair share, which I think is appropriate. And again, it shifts a lot of the burden on ratepayer. So, like I said, to me, I think that's actually good news.
So if I understand at the end of this presentation, based on the proposed rate increase, it seems it's not for a typical tier 1 resident, it will be about $1.50.
I think we can go back and look, but yeah, I think they had, because what,
Yeah.
17 units was the average usage, right? Yeah.
Yeah, John's
That's the
showing
question
right
year one,
here.
And then after that would be 2% on top of that.
So, yeah, I mean, again, it's not that big of a difference.
So
really.
that would be the first year, right?
Correct, and then it's going to kind of go up
Yeah.
on that kind of increment
Right.
but still, I mean, that's not that
So-
much.
So based on that increase,
I mean, gas goes up more.
I
than
don't
that.
think how would we, and this is just a general question, how would we allow for discounts like the veteran discount and, unless we can get it in the back end, how are we going to be able to? Because I mean, I pretty much like the senior citizen one. I mean, they're on a fixed income. I mean, these bills are already high as they are. I mean, not to maybe the average, but when they're on Social Security.
To fund, to do the funding that we're talking about here, we're talking about operating revenues. There's what are called non-operating revenues, and in order to fund a program like that, you cannot use operating revenues. It has to be non-operating revenues. Probably the best example is your investment income. You can use a portion of that money to help fund the program should you desire to go that direction. But it has to be something that's non-operating based revenue. We have lease agreements for cell towers. You can use that because it's not part of our normal operating revenue we get from our customers.
So it's non-rate revenue.
Non-rate revenue, correct.
So if you go back to this thing, we're going to dip into which color? The blue? Or
It would not dip into the reserve level itself, except for the portion of that interest that would be applied to the particular year's graph. So, for example, if you did the low income program, you're looking at roughly about a little over $500,000 a year. That in turn would reserve that you have by that $500,000.
that's a lot of money.
Yeah, so a couple examples. There's a low-income rate assistance for about $500,000, and the veterans would be perhaps another $500,000 if we wanted to do both. So it's something for the board to consider if they wanted to do those. Those are not baked into these numbers.
No, it's
Correct. They're
Because
not.
Yeah,
it's a
that
different
has to
source
be a
of revenue.
separate discussion.
We took a look at this because it came up in the finance
Sure.
committee to see what other utilities are doing, and we found out that 8 of the 10 other utilities we surveyed actually have a low-income program. Southern California Edison has a low-income program. Gas company has a low-income program.
Yeah.
So it was a reasonable question to ask us to survey that, so that's what we did, and the results came back.
Well, I like the idea. I think that our community does need a low-income program. But I realize that it's not being part of the rate increase. So I like that. I just want to make able sure that we're not like dipping more into our reserves that are already decreasing based on that graph.
Well, I have to admit that it is, because when we look at the reserve levels that have been based on the graph, it includes the principal that we now have plus the interest that we earn is included on those bar graphs for each year. So if we take $500,000 off of for a program, then that one bar goes down by $500,000.
Well, maybe that's something that the finance committee can chew on a little more as far as what non-operating revenues we can maybe look at utilizing for that kind of a program. But again, separate and apart from the rate increase
It's a
discussion.
good point. I was actually researching that today to try to figure out different options for
Okay.
us, so we can definitely discuss it.
Is there any questions?
I just
We've been dominating it over here.
the veterans. I wouldn't assume that all veterans are of a low income status.
No, it'd be separate.
So-
Yeah, Director Bennett, that the programs are independent of each other. So in the case of a veteran, if you're still eligible as long as you're a veteran. It doesn't matter whether you're low income or not. They're two distinct programs.
Mhm.
So a veteran would automatically, just being a veteran, qualify?
Just being a
Yeah.
veteran would qualify
Yeah,
you. It doesn't matter if you made $1 million or $30,000. It was the veteran's the qualification.
And I think we can provide better, more examples of how those programs work. As I said before, they're really keyed off the low-income program in Edison, and they do the qualification for you. You don't have to do that, and you come up with an amount. So let's delve into that further before we.
Well,
I don't want to give you the false impression that we can do a veterans program regardless of income level. Let's check on that.
sure, and yeah, I mean, for most veterans, I know my dad carries a copy of his DD 214 in his wallet when he goes to Home Depot, so he can get his veterans discount there. So I'm sure most veterans can provide the documentation. But yeah, something for the committee to look into with legal.
Okay, so just to piggyback on your comment, are you saying that veterans are not really low income, so maybe it's not really, the discount is not as important as if we focus on the elderly or low income?
I heard disabled were also in the conversation. I would consider them more of a priority than just a general veteran.
Got it. Now I understand. Thank you for that. And
Kelvin, do you have any questions? No. Dan?
I think the biggest thing with all the discounts we've talked about are part of this Prop 218 proposals, that we still have responsibilities to those who are making the regular payments, who have regular jobs, which I fall into, and I think all of us do. So, but I want to make sure that we still focus on what we've been doing, the good work we've been doing, and keeping our rates low and helping the general public and general customers within West Valley.
And one last thing, I'm sorry, just one last thing, Greg.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to make sure that if we're going to be including grant money into the, I know you did one of the slides, is that it's grant money that we're getting from our local officials and not from internal, because I don't think we have a grants team here.
Actually, the grant funding that we're talking about could be earmark money that we get from the federal government. It can be state grants. It can be money that we receive from the county. So we're receiving it from any other government entity that we're getting the funding from. So when we say grants, it's earmarks included.
Okay.
So
Thank
it's not just the one source of a grant. It's any kind of federal money that's coming in, state money that's coming in.
And
So we pegged the number of $1 million a year.
Yeah.
And I think that based on the results that we've
Done
recently been
lately.
having, I thought that was a conservative number to
that's-
put into the
Yeah,
schedule.
that's conservative. We're doing much better than that right now. So.
But I didn't want to.
No, I agree.
overpump
Let's underplan for that. But yeah, I think $1 million is a reasonable target for us on a consistent basis. Any other questions?
No,
All
good.
right. Well, thank you so much, John, for the presentation. You gave us a lot to think about, and certainly we'll, I'm sure, have many more discussions with you and with the staff when it comes to this, but it's certainly a good first step. And I don't know, is there anything else that we talk on this, or is that pretty much it?
No, I just want to thank Bill and John for the presentation. I mean, that was a lot of detail. I know it took a lot of man hours to put them together. So thank you so much for that presentation. It was very detailed and very thorough. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, the board would like us to look at and bring back information that includes a higher level of CIP and perhaps a higher estimate on like construction cost index, and see what impacts those might have, the pros and cons to that. Well, increase in rates versus the
Sure.
positive benefits,
Yeah.
and these other details such as the rate income or
Yeah,
rate
and-
assistance program.
And I'd say working with BBK and
Clarify some of those
loot fee on
opportunities.
the process and what other steps we need to as we start to get at least a little closer to starting that grind towards the 218 process now that we have this cost of study and some actual numbers. But yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, thank you all very much. You all have a good evening, and we are adjourned.